Hello viewers, welcome to CEC Gurukul lectures. I am Dr. Sanavar Soham from Kalindi College, University of Delhi, and today in this lecture I will be discussing plant communities. Now, as we all know, in areas such as forests, rivers and mountains, various species of living organisms coexist. The species of plants, animals and microbes live together in an area and form an essential component of the community existing in that area. The group of species that occupy a particular area and interact with each other directly or indirectly is called a biological community. Now, the interrelationships between these organisms determine the functional attributes of an ecosystem, such as the energy flow or cycling of the nutrients. Now, in this lecture, I'll discuss about the main features of a community, the level of organization with emphasis to community characteristics. So, moving on to the understanding of what a community is. A community is an assemblage of species or populations that are present in a specific area at a particular time. The species are capable of interacting with each other. They represent biotic or living component of the ecosystem. The species are ecologically or dynamically independent of each other, but they share feeding relationships and habitat. Now, interactions among the species or the populations that make up the ecological community give rise to the properties of the community. For example, in a field condition, various types of grasses, insects, worms, birds and mammals, they interact with each other in various ways. Now, the grasses, they provide food to insects, mammals and habitat to worms and birds. The insects provide food for the birds which feed on worms, and all these organisms constitute part of a field community. Similarly, various species of living organisms are present in forest, desert, mountains, river and lakes. So, they represent an important component of their respective communities. Thus, various species are important members of natural communities. In a community, the organisms share feeding relationship through food chains. Now, each species depend upon many other species for food. These species are functionally unrelated. This means that the species in a community may not be directly related to each other, but indirectly they share various feeding relations. The size of the community is variable. Areas such as a forest have a large community size with many species of plants, birds, insects, reptiles, mammals living together. In contrast, a log of wood represents a small community that supports only insect species. As you can see in the slide, the communities such as forests are autotrophic. This is because they include plant species which carry out photosynthesis by deriving energy from the sun. The communities found in springs, caves, they are heterotrophic. Why? As they depend on organic material such as detritus for energy. Now, if a community is composed of a plant of same species and same age, it is referred to as stand. This term is applied to a more or less uniform area of vegetation. For example, in a wheat field, we see there are many wheat plants almost of same age at a particular time at a particular area. Now, no specific boundaries are present that can demarcate the beginning of a new community and end of a new community. So, this is known as community gradient. The communities grade into each other. For example, in forest communities, we cannot differentiate where the boundary of one forest ecosystem starts and other ends. So in moving at distance, we can make out the difference in species present in the area. The communities can be distinguished on the basis of observable differences in their physical and biological characteristics. The species possess specific characteristics at different physical environments. Now the species composition also changes with changes in the physical elevation. Some ecologists had given the concept of continuum. Continuum means there are no distinct communities with well-defined boundaries, but a gradual change in space and time is noted along a gradient, and this is known as community gradient. This could be because of change in the factors such as moisture, temperature change, soil type change, altitude, or combination of all these changes. Hence, there are no sharp borders or changes in specific composition in these areas. So, when we discuss about the gradation, the most important term we are going to discuss is ecotone. What is ecotone? It is a transitional zone, the zone of vegetation that separates two different types of communities. Two different types of communities are basically present in a zone which can be wide or which can be narrow. For example, an area connecting the forest and grasslands or a stream running between the meadows. So, in this diagram you can see that we have a grassland zone and a forest zone. So, the community where the grassland is overlapping with the forest zone is known as the ecozone. So, the gradation is happening. It is not that there is an abrupt shutdown of grassland community, but indeed, in fact, there is a zone, a common zone where both type of communities are present, and this zone is known as ecotone. For example, if we talk about an area connecting the forest and grasslands as talked in the diagram, or stream running between meadows, the vegetation of this zone, the ecotone, becomes highly specialized. Why? Because the region can be narrow or wide and the vegetation is influenced by the environmental conditions. This region between a pond and surrounding upland is also an example of a narrow ecotone. It possesses a sufficiently high number of species, that is, greater species diversity at a time. Now, the number of species is higher in this region as compared to the neighboring regions. Why? Because in this zone we have the populations from both the communities which represent both the communities. This area contains species from both communities adjacent to each other. Increased variety of plants are present at a particular boundary, and this is called edge effect. Now, moving on to the discussion of community characters. Now, first and foremost, we'll discuss about the form and structure, which is also known as physiognomy. And the form and structure of a community can be assessed by certain characters and functions. The structure of a terrestrial community is defined in terms of its vegetation. The plants in a community are characterized by various sizes and forms, such as tall, medium, short, evergreen, deciduous, woody, herbaceous, herbs, shrubs, and so on. Within each category, further distinctions are noted. For example, evergreen trees can be broad-leaved or can be needle-leaved as well. So, each community possesses certain characteristics, and these vary according to the level of organization. The characters are of two types. First, the analytical characters, and other one, the synthetic characters. So, moving on to understanding of what are analytical characters. They are further characterized into two categories, into two types, the quantitative and the qualitative analytical characters. Now, qualitative characters, as the name suggests, are difficult to measure, whereas the quantitative characters can be measured easily. So, these are mainly they include composition, they include physiognomy, phenology, stratification, abundance, sociability, vitality, vigor, and life form. We will discuss all these qualitative aspects one by one in this lecture. So, starting up with the floristic composition. So, if we want to understand a community, we need to understand its composition. This refers to the type of species occurring within the community. Now, in every community, some species are abundantly present and are referred to as dominant species. In a community, both plants and animals are present, but the community is named after the dominant plant species because the plants, they are stationary and remain in that region throughout their life. So, the floristic composition of the community is studied in detail and a list of species present in the community is then prepared. Among plants, vascular species are counted and the species appearing in different seasons are considered because according to the seasons, the appearance of the species will vary. Now, the community is named after the species that occurs more frequently and in most of the seasons. Now, measurement of floristic composition gives us an idea about the following. First, the relationships of a particular species with the environment and with each other occurring in that area. So, the first thing is the floristic composition, which tells us about is the relationship between different species present in the area. Then it also tells about the habitat of different species. The third important thing which is known by this character is the ecological amplitude of the species. Now, ecological amplitude is the limit of the environmental conditions that are basically present in that particular time. So, we also come to know about the ecological amplitude along with the present conditions and future trends of the community. That how the trend or how the community or the species in the community will be changing. For example, Adathoda vesica is a winter annual plant. It grows at a low temperature and in association with species such as Capparis sepiaria. Now, it shows relationship with environment and other species. The occurrence of this species in hilly and rock areas indicate its habitat. The strong association between the species acts as an indicator of the presence of other species. So, with the presence of one species, we come to know about the appearance or about the existence of other species. Now, each species possesses its own range of tolerance capacity for any environmental condition or factor. So, the abundance of a species over an area, it indicates that prevailing conditions, they exert a favorable effect on its survival. This gives an idea about its ecological amplitude. That is the variation in the environmental conditions and how a plant is surviving in those conditions. Now, the floristic composition, besides telling us about the presence or absence of a species, it also indicates present conditions and future trends. A decline in number of particular species from an area indicates the increase in adverse environmental conditions. Now, moving on to the next character, which is stratification of vegetation. This is also a very important feature of a plant community and in understanding of plant community. There are different vertical strata in the community. So, the growth forms of plant determines the vertical structure, which includes their size, branching and leaves. The vertical structure is generally greatly influenced by physical feature such as light. Now, stratification occurs because different plant types differ in their requirements and ecological amplitude with respect to light, intensity, temperature, moisture condition, soil and biotic factors. In each community, vertical structure has a stratification of distinct vertical layers. Now, the growth of a plant measured in terms of size, branching, etc. determines the vertical structure. A well-developed forest ecosystem has different layers of vegetation. It possesses species such as trees, herbs, shrubs and grasses. There is canopy layer, the understory layer, the shrub layer, the herb or ground layer and the forest layer. Now in this slide you can see that there is a vertical stratification of a forest. So we can see that we have evergreen forest. This is the canopy which is formed by the tallest trees. Then we can see above 150 meters we can see there is a canopy area formed by the smaller trees. Further we go down, this is the plant canopy which is made up by shrubs and this is known as the undergrowth. So we can very well see the vertical stratification of the forest of all the species which are present in a community. Now this type of vertical stratification is seen in tropical forest. In these forests, in addition to all these layers, we find lianas and climbers. The canopy is site for energy fixation through photosynthesis and the canopy structure present in a forest. So a canopy is said to be open when light reaches the lower layers as well. Now in such areas, shrubs and understory vegetation is well developed. In a closed forest, most of the light is intercepted by tree canopies and understory plants, they remain deprived of light. In these areas, shade tolerant species having poor growth of herbaceous layers, they develop. Now in a forest with 4 layers of strata, they support greater diversity of life forms in comparison to the grassland vegetation which has only 2 strata. So the stratification is also exhibited by the aquatic ecosystems. The strata of aquatic ecosystems, they are determined by the physical characteristics of the water column. Now, in a lake and ocean ecosystems, the light penetration, the temperature and availability of oxygen varies with the depth. In summer, a lake has various stratifications. The upper layers present on the surface is called epilimnion. It possesses a layer of freely circulating water with uniform temperature. The second layer is known as metalimnion, which is characterized by a thermocline, that is rapid decline in temperature. And the third is called as hypolimnion, which is deep, dense water having low oxygen content and mud at the bottom. The upper zone that receives sufficient light is dominated by phytoplanktons, and here the photosynthesis occurs at a very rapid rate, whereas in the lower layers the light is less, so decomposition takes place. The stratification has a profound influence in supporting animal life. It influences the diversity of animals present in a community. A strong correlation that has been found between height of the vegetation and species diversity of the birds. The increased vertical stratification increases the availability of resources and living space. This favors degree of specialization. The grasslands with 2 strata hold 6 to 7 species of bird and ground nesters, while a deciduous forest supports about 30 species of birds. So the vertical stratification is also basically telling us about the variety of the animals or the birds present in that community. Now in this slide, you can very well see the vertical stratification of the pond. And you can see various zones, the epilimnion and hypolimnion. You can see the stratification of the pond ecosystem where there is circulation of water in the top layer, and it depending upon the weather conditions. In summers there is more circulation, in winters there is less circulation. So depending upon all these conditions, the species and the presence of species in the pond also varies. The third characteristic is periodicity. It refers to changes in characteristics of a community with seasonal changes. Each species has different requirement for light, temperature, moisture and other environmental factors. Now accordingly, the period of growth events such as seed germination, vegetative development, flowering, fruiting, that is the reproductive phase, The fruit and seed dispersal and seed dissemination varies for each species. A study that collects the data for time of these events is called phenology. Now, from the calendar of the events, we can predict the appearance of a community at different times of the year. Now, moving on to the next important character, the vitality and vigor. Now, vitality is the capacity of the plant to complete its life cycle. Now, vigor is the health or development of plant at a particular stage in the life cycle. So, it is determined by the rate and amount of growth. So, the parameters include changes in height, area of foliage, color, and turgidity of stems and leaves, degree of damage caused by the insects, time and appearance of flowers, fruits, development of new stem and leaves. So, we can see that Daubenmeier in this slide classified the vitality into different groups. We can see V1 was those plants whose seedlings die. He categorized the plants with seedlings grow but unable to reproduce as V2. In V3, it was the plants that reproduced vegetatively. V4 were the plants that reproduced sexually but were uncommon. V5 reproduces sexually and grow regularly. So, based on all these, we classify the vegetation of a community. Now, moving on to the life forms. We know that the nature of vegetation tells about the form and structure of a community. Now, vegetation can be characterized into different types such as herbs, shrubs and trees. The further characterization is done on the basis of height such as tall or short, texture such as herbaceous or woody, nature of occurrence such as evergreen or deciduous. Further, divisions have been suggested on the characteristic of the leaves such as needle-leaved evergreen leaves, broad-leaved evergreen, broad-leaved deciduous or grasses, etc. Roncaer gave a system of classification of plants and he classified according to the relation of their height above the ground to the perinating organ. The organ that survives from one growth season to the next, remaining active throughout the summer but inactive during the winter period. So, this was known as or referred to as the perinating organ. It generally includes the embryonic or meristematic tissues of buds, bulbs, tubers, roots and seeds. So, the 5 forms of plants that have been characterized include phanerophytes, chemophytes, hemicryptophytes, cryptophytes and therophytes. So, these are 5 kind of classification, 5 categories that were given by Roncaer to explain the life forms. Now, starting with phanerophytes. The perinating organs, which include buds, are present on erect shoots and the shoots present above the ground. The buds are naked and exposed to external environmental conditions. These include trees, shrubs and climbers that are present in the tropical climate. So, in the next lecture, I will discuss all these 5 categories in details. Thank you.